This tale of the emperor's mistress, who until recently was convinced that their feelings were genuine, but at some point, he accused her of trying to destroy the pregnant empress. And in doing so, he not only betrayed her and his wife, on account of his own mistake, so that no one might know of it, in charging the poisoning of his wife, the emperor did not stop to, assuming that the mistress would want to talk about what happened between them. The guy didn't think for long. He decided to get rid of her, explaining that it was just punishment for trying to destroy his wife and future son. It's a convenient excuse, because whatever a girl says, no one will believe her anyway. So not only was she betrayed, but she made up accusations, by which the emperor has the right to order her life and punish her as he sees fit. So all he wants to do is make sure no one ever finds out the truth from her. Otherwise, he'll lose his family, and for the rest of his life, he'll be known as a cheater and a liar. In the last moments of her life, the girl began to pray for only one thing: an opportunity to get revenge on this man and make sure everyone knows the truth, and finally realize that for their own gain, and for fear of losing their title. He's even willing to get rid of the person who could make him lose it all at any moment. But is he so insensitive that watching an innocent man being abused? It doesn't make him emotional or willing to admit guilt. At this point, the girl didn't fight back and realized it was pointless. She tried to be a good person, and as it turns out, it didn't work out so well. Mistakenly trusting the emperor's beautiful words and promises, Ariella regretted it very much, when suddenly, already resigned to her own doom, she saw a light of some kind, and I didn't realize what was going on. And after that, everything started happening in a fog and became very dreamlike. Then Ariella heard a very familiar voice, which reminded her very much of her own sister's voice. As soon as the girl saw her right in front of her, she just couldn't believe her eyes. But is it really just a memory that started in her mind before she died? Except it all looks and feels so realistic that initially it caused her great apprehension and anxiety. But that wasn't all. As soon as Mia suddenly touched her hand, Ariella screamed loudly. So when she heard her own voice, she began to realize that this was definitely not a dream. At this point, her sister clearly didn't expect this reaction, and neither did their father. A man happened to be near this room and, as usual, decided to take advantage of the situation and began to resent it. Ariella looked at him, but still had nothing to say for herself. It's not like she can say she screamed out loud because she was suddenly transported back in time. If that's the case, which remains to be seen and confirmed. And now you'll have to endure the presence and unpleasant words from your father. Since Ariella has no intention of telling them what happened, they'll never know the real reason for her screaming. The fact is that all her childhood, the girl was humiliated by her family and had to grow up in such conditions. She was constantly punished, abused, and called names for no reason. She was used to aggression from her father and never heard him say nice things, much less felt supported or cared for by him. Ariella has never been loved and made it clear that she is an extra in this house. Therefore, she has no trust in them, much less love. In any case, she'd better not arouse any suspicion and try to figure out what happened on her own. Meanwhile, her sister started a thread about someone's mistress. At this point, it's hard to make sense of these words, but Ariella is trying to. It's very important to understand the exact moment she went back in time. But unfortunately, judging from the conversation between my sister and my father, the only thing that became clear was that they wanted to lock her up in the attic and keep her until when she's useful and can get some work done. Judging by words like mistress, lover, vacation, and emperor, she was certainly starting to get a hunch. But is her own father really capable and willing to give up his daughter for his own gain? After a while, without asking permission, her father's aides took her by the arms, and without explaining anything, they took him to a dark room. The girl asked to be let go, but her request was simply ignored. The guys were given orders, and have no right to do anything contrary to the order of the master. Meanwhile, they left her alone with the rats and spiders, locked the door, and dumped her like a guilty person, when in fact she'd done nothing wrong. Making sure her sister was at the door, Ariella turned to her and asked for help, to which Mia replied that it was her destiny and she had no right to interfere with her father's decision and plans. The girl hinted that instead of trying to resist, she should be preparing herself for her impending acquaintance. Ariella tried to find out some information about it, but as usual, no one saw fit to tell her anything. In response, The girl started banging on the door even harder, showing her indignation, when suddenly, very unexpectedly, her sister said that she was very jealous of her. Though Ariella was a mistress, but still royal. It made Ariella even angrier, because she was convinced that she had to rely on herself. No one's even hiding why they locked her in that attic and what she has to prepare for. The only thing she started thinking about at that moment was running away, when suddenly, the girl suddenly felt a strange sensation. She saw some glare though, being in the attic. There should be nothing like it. Ariella immediately went to the mirror and surprisingly found no scars on her face, which means that while they were in this place, they somehow just disappeared. Still, some time later, she found herself in an entirely different room and felt the familiar sensation of the... She started touching her face and looking at her body, and in that way, everything became clear to her at once. Something incredible happened. Her appearance became the same as it had been a while ago, but has she time-traveled back to a past that was long before all this happened? When she had no idea what fate had in store for her and what difficulties she would face in the future. At the time, this attic was her room, and it turns out, when she felt she was in another room, she just confused that feeling with an unfamiliar sense of self and a new reality, which means a girl has a unique opportunity to influence her own destiny and make sure she never has to go through that torture and abuse again. Ariella realizes she'll never get a second chance like this again, so she must take revenge on everyone who had anything to do with her death, namely his own father, sister, and of course, the emperor and his wife. At this point, the girl can't handle it, so the only option she has left to get revenge is to become someone's lover again. Either way, it's worth it to try and fix things and prevent your demise. First, Ariella broke a mirror to draw attention to herself, and started waiting for one of the maids to come into her room. The girl hurt herself on purpose with the shards, but so far it's hard to see what her plan is. Meanwhile, one of the maids came in, which means everything's going according to plan. Very interested in what happens as a result of this situation and what Ariella is trying to accomplish. The first thing she did was look at the maid and resent her for standing still, instead of calling a doctor or taking care of your mistress in any way. To which the assistant replied that unfortunately she was forbidden to help her master's daughter and do anything to help her get out or socialize with strangers. As it turned out, the girl expected such a reaction and was prepared for it in advance. She deliberately began to stand on the splinters to arouse pity and send the maid to call the doctor. And it worked. The woman went against orders and decided to help Ariella. And yet, it's still unclear why she's doing this and what we can expect next. Things were getting more and more unforeseeable. But anyway, she managed to get out of the room. The girl acts as carefully as possible so that no one suspects or thinks that she is up to something. Ariella calmly sat back in her chair and pretended that she really did need medical attention, except she forgot to hide the confident smile that could ruin the whole plan. After a while, her father and her sister Mia come to see her, but instead of helping her, he's more interested in the mess in the room. In that case, the girl decided to start with the most important thing and get down to business. Part of her plan is to accuse her assistants of being inattentive and irresponsible. She made it clear that because of that, she hurt her leg, and now it hurts to walk. And afterwards, seeing his aggressive look and desire to hit him, the girl got ahead of him and asked him not to do it. She hinted that if the emperor found out about it, he might get in trouble. Consequently, he wouldn't be able to get what he wanted. The man understood at once what it was about, for it concerned the prophet due to the emperor's further secret relationship with his daughter. At this point, Mia didn't like the confidence in her sister's eyes, so she decided to hint to her father that he shouldn't succumb to these manipulations, and that time could be used for more important things. In response, Ariella was not confused, and also knew what to say to that. She looked her straight in the eyes, and asked her not to interfere in this conversation, because otherwise, if she ignored this request, it would be worse for her. Mia had never heard something like that from her, and just because of that, she was very much surprised. For, like her father, she did not know how to react or what to say in response. But as usual, the man turned to his assistants and ordered her to be locked up again in some room that would be as far away as possible. Very well, to see that all present were surprised at her behavior, and understood that no one else could do the things that that she can refuse and, as a result, do the same thing she did in this situation. Lastly, Mia reminded her sister that unlike her, she wouldn't have to become someone's mistress, and she'll have a loving husband to whom she owes nothing, and their feelings will be real. It was the most hurtful and unpleasant thing she could have said to her sister, but this time, the girl did not start crying, but on the contrary, looked at her with a confident look, and finally convinced that she was obliged to take revenge on all these people, because allowing yourself to say something like that to her would no longer go unpunished as it usually did. The girl is looking forward to having each of them on her together and experience what it's like to live among people who want to get rid of her and have only bad intentions. Ariella was used to this kind of life, but she had definitely decided that it couldn't go on any longer. In the meantime, she asked everyone to leave her room, as it was getting too unpleasant to be in their presence. And as soon as she saw her father's barely contained fist, she explained that it no longer aroused any emotion in her, much less concern. So he doesn't have to try to intimidate her or feel guilty for wanting to be alone. As a result, he never had anything to say to that. The man silently turned around and started to walk out of that room. I could feel the aggressive energy from him very well, but now it's ridiculous to watch. The girl no longer sees him as someone to be feared and tried to please. After a while, she started to look at her room, and at that moment, she wondered very much why, relative to the other rooms, this was so uncomfortable and very dirty. Ariella asked who had been keeping an eye on this room while she wasn't here. But in response, she heard nothing but silence and warned that if they didn't answer now, it would only get worse. Afterwards, the maids explained that the girl always preferred to be alone. So, they left this room untouched. In response, instead of blaming, she asked them to fix it within a few hours. The maids did it much faster. They were able to make it comfortable and make it so the girl just can't recognize her room. It's never been this clean and tidy. It's become so nice to be here that she doesn't think she'll ever want to leave again. And as soon as she was alone, she started thinking and planning for tomorrow, unfortunately. She has to visit the palace and see the face of the man she'd most like to forget. One day when she was once again kicked out of the house for no reason, the girl had no idea that on that very day, she would meet the crown prince for the first time, which it would have been better to avoid. He happened to see her in the street, and unfortunately he didn't pass her by. At that point, he didn't even ask if the girl wanted to talk to him or how she was out on the street at that time. He confidently approached her and began to say such words, after which no girl cannot remain indifferent. He started promising her a wonderful future and a happy life together that she couldn't even dream of. At that point, if Ariella had known where this was going, she never would have pursued this conversation, and even more so, to believe those fairy tale words that had not an ounce of truth and sincerity in them. Surprisingly, during the conversation, she did not find it strange that, after a few minutes' acquaintance, he asked her out without even knowing her name or other relevant information. The next day, he came to make a formal proposal and get her consent. It was unexpected, but only because he was the first person she'd ever heard her declare her love to, Ariella agreed. After that, she had to accompany him to various social events where he introduced her as his acquaintance. Strangely enough, the girl was never embarrassed by it, and so for 3 years they were lovers. She constantly imagined a future together and was sure he would make her empress. Everything was so perfect that I didn't even think there might be a catch. After a while, all those dreams and promises quietly faded away. His wife found out about this secret relationship, and gradually, Ariella didn't even notice how she became the one they planned to get rid of in the near future. Turns out, until she was bullied by the prince's wife, Ariella had no idea that he was married and in a relationship with him. She was a common lover. But that wasn't the worst thing she had to learn at that point. If he had just come clean and offered to break up, it would have been a lot better. Then after a secret relationship, decide to get rid of her and make sure Ariella doesn't tell anyone about it. In fact, the girl did not deserve such a betrayal, because initially she did not know about his wife and believed that he really loved her. Therefore, given the opportunity to relive that moment, she doesn't intend to make the same mistakes. The next day came, and it was hours away from that moment of reunion. Assistants offered their help in choosing an outfit and hairstyle, to which the girl replied that she plans to be the most beautiful girl in the empire, and most importantly, that everyone should look up to her. She was immediately discouraged and advised to go for a quieter image that wouldn't attract too much attention, to which the girl replied that on this day she had other plans, to which something luxurious and beautiful would be perfect. She plans to be the center of attention and be admired by everyone around her. And as soon as Ariella told them about it, she regretted it. The aide started criticizing her. And speak your mind, which the girl didn't ask for because she doesn't care what they think about it. She has a concrete plan and realizes that if she starts taking advice, nothing good will come of it. In the meantime, she has created her own image and feels as confident in it as possible. She had already arrived at the palace, and very unexpectedly, the emperor himself came out to meet her, but he was so looking forward to this meeting that he couldn't stand it and decided to do it instead of his assistants. He helped her out of the carriage and started to make a good impression of himself. But this time, he wouldn't succeed. Ariella knows this man and will never make past mistakes or trust someone like him again. As soon as the girl felt his touch, she tried her best to hide how uncomfortable it made her feel. She remembered his betrayal and looked forward to the moment when he would finally regret it. At this point, the other assistants joined him and began to greet the long-awaited guest. Ariella already knows that these smiles have nothing to do with genuine emotion and are fake smiles. And yet she does the same thing to avoid any suspicion in her direction. A few minutes later, and we started heading to the mansion. And this moment, it's the most memorable. Ariella is here again, and at the sight of all these rooms, she's having some not-so-pleasant memories. She found herself back in a place that had ruined her life, and one she'd least like to return to. Luckily, this time, she has a future plan whereby nothing like this will ever happen again. First of all, she thanked the guy for the invitation and began to marvel at the beauty of this house as if she were in it for the first time. A girl has to pretend, because if she doesn't, she might be suspected of something. As expected, on the very first day he started surprising her and took her out to a fancy dinner. And to make it even more pleasant and memorable for her, he has prepared many gifts for her. And of course, she received many compliments on her looks, outfit, and hairstyle. Immediately afterwards, people around him started saying the same thing, which also doesn't seem very sincere. The thing is, sometime before the meeting, they were told to treat her as politely as possible and pretend that they're all really excited to meet each other, when in fact, they're not at all. Anyway, so far everything's going according to plan, which means we need to keep moving forward. Ariella thanked for those beautiful words and made it clear that despite such a beautiful moment, she'd like to get some rest after the long drive. The guy clearly wasn't expecting something like this. He looked at her and saw that the girl did look a little tired. He had no idea that it's really just part of the plan and the incredible ability to pretend to be tired like it really is. And yet, before saying goodbye, the guy asked his staff if there was anyone else left who hadn't greeted the guest. Everyone started looking around at each other to see if everyone had shown respect for the girl. As it turned out, Ariella knew the answer to that question and decided that this time she wouldn't be silent. The girl reminded herself that her mistress never came out to her, for etiquette dictated that all royalty should greet one another. Initially, she took it as a minor tardiness, but she just doesn't seem to want to see her. Surprisingly, Ariella wasn't afraid to say something like that about his wife, and from the start, embarrassed the prince. To remedy the situation, the boy ordered his assistant to summon the Empress. Just a few minutes later, of course, she came down to the living room. At this point, she did her best to make those around her notice her displeasure and unwillingness to talk to Ariella. So, unlike everyone else around her, she was the only one who was satisfied and in control. The girl looked at the Empress and said that finally, they saw each other. But in response, the Empress didn't even look in her direction and barely restrained herself from walking backwards. As Ariella continued to pretend, she started to get excited about cohabitation because they would be able to see each other every day. As suddenly, the girl casually addressed the Empress by name and in the same second, apologized for it. To which Liti replied that she could use some etiquette before coming to the royal palace. To which the girl replied that because of her exemption from the royal code, she didn't have to learn it. The guy promised that once Ariella got to the palace, she could do whatever she wanted. The emperor confirmed these words and explained that in his opinion, this was the best possible option. As they talk, it's obvious that the girl is constantly trying to embarrass each of them. It gives her incredible pleasure, for she knows that, for the time being, they will do everything they can to keep the girl from changing her mind and staying here. When suddenly the Empress suddenly began to feel ill, fainted, and fell to the floor. But it seems to be nothing more than acting and trying to get back to your room. Ariella is well aware of this and so has not even expressed any sympathy or desire to help. She didn't even think about helping the man who wants her dead. Not even a fellow came up to the Empress and was not ashamed to say that she had spoiled such a joyous occasion. Meanwhile, one of the assistants came up to them and informed them that the Grand Duke Richt had come to see His Majesty's. The lad gave his consent and asked him to bring a guest to this room, for they could not leave the Empress here alone. At this point, the girl looked at him and began to remember what that great duke looked like. Because in just a few minutes, she's going to see him and she's going to have to figure out how to act quickly. It turns out that Richt is Cassis's half-brother. The girl was never close to him, not even in her past life. After the battle for his inheritance, he fled to his northern neighbors, an emotionless mad soldier. Even the gods feared him. That's how society described him, because you can't say anything else about him. He wasn't the kind of person you'd want to do business with or be acquainted with. But today things have changed, and luckily now, a girl can use any situation to her advantage. She shouldn't miss this opportunity, and he seems like someone who could use some friendship and cooperation. Meanwhile, the guy walked up to his half-brother. He greeted him and said he was very happy to meet him. Cassis reciprocated him, for it just so happened that they had not seen him for too long. It's such a long-awaited meeting that the brothers can't stop looking at each other and rejoicing in the occasion. At this point, the girls tried to draw attention to themselves and greeted him at the same time, when suddenly, very unexpectedly, he addressed Ariella as Empress. Even those around him could not conceal their surprise, for hearing such a thing was inevitable. But that's not all. After that, he looked at Liti and perceived her as the Emperor's mistress, which made it all the more hurtful to hear him take it in his direction, being a true Empress. So, in an attempt to avoid the strongest conflict, his assistant explained that the gentleman was a little mistaken about because the girl with the blonde hair is the real Empress, whom he has just seriously offended. But for some reason, instead of apologizing, he turned to the aide and said he was never wrong and knew perfectly well who was who. Apparently, conflict could not be avoided after all. Everyone began to look at each other and were afraid to imagine what we can expect as a result of this situation, because obviously no one is going to ignore it. Ariella looked at Liti and imagined how she was feeling right now at this moment. After that, the guy turned to his brother and asked him to answer the question, why he changed the Empress from Ariella. Not surprisingly, people immediately started whispering and talking about it. Hearing these voices and the discussion of his decision, he turned to all present, and especially to his brother, and said his opinion that he didn't intend to discuss it in front of everyone around him. Immediately afterward, he ordered the event to end and asked everyone to go to their workstations. The guests went home, and the staff began to help the Empress, although there was really no need for it. After that, it was just the brothers and Ariella in the room, the girl eagerly waiting to see what the outcome would be. Richt turned to the Emperor and asked him to answer his question after all, to which the guy replied that he really hoped his brother hadn't forgotten that he was first and foremost an emperor and then his brother. Accordingly, he is not obliged to consult with anyone about any matter or decision. In that case, Richt rephrased his question and asked it in the way it was supposed to be asked. At this moment, the girl suddenly wished to leave them alone to avoid trouble. For this, she purposely poured out the contents of her dress as if it was a complete accident. She called it to their attention and made it clear that she had to go and change her clothes. It was so sudden that the guys forgot what they were talking about. In that case, in order not to send the girl alone, the Emperor went with her and proposed to propose this conversation at another time. Richt didn't object. He just silently started to see them off with a look and agreed to the proposal. On the way to her room, the Emperor began to apologize for spoiling her first banquet, to which the girl replied that it was not at all necessary because more importantly, Richt doesn't seem to know what's going on at the palace. In response, Cassis tried to avoid the subject, and judging by his reaction, that clearly meant something. Ariella is pretty sure he has something to hide, but since that's the case, she's bound to find out. Lest the girl should begin to guess at anything, he went up to her, took her hand, and tried to distract her from unwelcome thoughts. Cassis warned that she shouldn't think about any problems, much less other people's problems. Instead, it would be better to think about herself and go to rest. She didn't ignore the offer. Besides, after what happened, that's what was needed. For surely the Emperor took care to choose the best and brightest room for her. And as soon as they arrived at their destination, and it was time to say goodbye, Ariella asked if he would like to stay. But in response, he decided to offer an alternative and promised that due to the sheer amount of things to do, they would only be able to have dinner together tonight. He asked his assistants to prepare the girl for this moment, and did whatever she asked or wished them to do. Last of all, she thanked him for his care, and said she was looking forward to having dinner together tonight. Meanwhile, the maids began to tidy up her room and pretend they were actually doing something. And at that moment, Ariella continued to think about his last words, and she seemed to recognize it as a lie. Because most likely, he is going to meet some person and something happens that she does not know about in such a case. In order not to get upset and not to think about something bad, the girl decided to go for a walk. The maids immediately noticed this and offered their help, to which the girl replied that this time she wanted to be alone, explaining that she just needed time to collect her thoughts and think about what was important. But she seems to be up to something and wants all the answers to her questions as soon as possible. It is very important for her to know all the information she needs to draw conclusions and plan ahead. It turns out that instead of taking a walk, Ariella has gone in search of the Emperor in the south wing of the mansion. She only has an hour before he heads in her direction. She was able to find him, but unfortunately she couldn't get any closer. From this place she won't hear a word they're saying or know what they're talking about. As suddenly, because the window was open, the letter from the desk in the study was blown by the wind right into the street where the girl was standing. Fortunately, she reacted in time, was able to go unnoticed, and most importantly, she heard the Emperor's request that the aides return the letter to him immediately. And what is most interesting is that he immediately changed his mind and ordered them to get rid of it, warning them that their lives would depend on how secure the contents of the letter would be. But there's one small problem. If she's spotted by any of the Emperor's staff now, there may be questions about what she's doing here, and with what intention she found herself right outside the Emperor's study as he was discussing something secret from everyone. And of course the girl couldn't help herself, and decided to take this letter with her to find out what His Majesty might be hiding. It's a very brave thing to do, because if anyone finds out about it, the punishment will be appropriate. And in the meantime, Ariella's doing her best to unravel the mystery and do it her way. She managed to sneak back to her room, but was this mission really that easy? And now she's about to learn the Emperor's biggest secret, one he's never told even to those he trusts. As long as he doesn't order that letter to be searched through the personal belongings of every person in this mansion, which is likely, the contents of the letter are so secret, he'll probably do just that. So since she had some time and opportunity, she opened it right away and didn't delay. And once she did and read the contents, the girl just couldn't believe her eyes. It turns out the late father of the current emperor ordered Ariella to be the next empress, which means his son didn't heed that order, and for whatever reason, did it his way. Really curious how the girl will react to this, and what she'll do when she finds out how things were really supposed to be. I can see why the emperor's brother was so surprised that another girl was empress. Seems to have no intention of forgiving him for such an act, so he asked his assistant to tell the emperor that by the end of the month he must put everything back to the way their father wanted it, and that if he failed to meet the deadline, he knows what awaits him if he doesn't do it and ignores his request. It sounds very intriguing, but it's very interesting to see what he means by that. Immediately after the conversation, his aide went to the emperor's study to warn him of the consequences of the. He is very interested to know why the Lord is so concerned about this situation and doesn't want anyone other than Ariella as empress. And even more confusingly, Richt asked me to give him some kind of liquid in a jar that looked like perfume or something. The thing was, Richt, as usual, without any explanation, asked me to give this thing to his brother. and hinted that she should influence the emperor's answer, for he knew something and would certainly take the hint. But on one condition, his assistant must not reveal that it was given to him by his brother. For some reason, he shouldn't know that information. When suddenly, before going to the emperor, the assistant dared to express his opinion on the subject, and without even finishing, the lord stopped him and made it clear that he gave him no right to interfere in the matter, much less advise him on anything. The aide turned around, admitted his guilt, and silently went to fulfill his master's request. Meanwhile, the girl is still in her room. She still doesn't understand what she should do in this situation in order to benefit, and at the same time, not to regret if something does not work out. It's so serious that if she makes one mistake, it could cost her too much. She sat down on her bed and began to analyze her past. For now, she knew much that would allow her to do the right thing next. As suddenly, there was a sudden knock on the door, and as it turned out, on the way to the emperor, the guy realized that in fact, he was not listening well to his master, and mistakenly thought that the thing was to be taken to the emperor, so he remembered in time. For to the emperor he must give only some words, and this thing Ariella. The girl greeted the guy and immediately asked what she could help him with, and the guy said he had something to give her, but he couldn't give her any more information. Ariella saw this beautiful jar, and for a few minutes couldn't get enough of it. No wonder she immediately started asking him lots of questions and wondering who had given her such a gift, to which the guy replied that it was a gift from someone who wished to remain anonymous. So he won't be able to say his name or give a hint as to who this person is. Anyway, the girl didn't insist and asked me to pass on her thanks, suggesting that surely that person, obviously a woman of good taste. At the same second, the lad could not help laughing a little, for he had imagined his master in the form of a woman, and afterwards he apologized and asked for permission to go back to his master. Ariella said goodbye to him, and judging by the gift, her mood had improved considerably, when suddenly someone knocked on the door again, and this time it was her assistants. They said they'd come to see her off to dinner and help her clean up, to which the girl replied that she would gladly accept the offer. After a while, the girl promised them that all who wished could join them at the table. I really wonder if this is part of her next plan and what she's trying to accomplish. Meanwhile, their conversation had suddenly turned to the subject of the secret gift, or rather its sender. Already many people are interested in this, and despite a great deal of speculation, Ariella, like everyone else, has no idea who this person is and whether you can find out anything about it, because it seems impossible. And of course, the maids couldn't help but notice the huge amount of presents in her room. They assumed they were all from relatives or acquaintances, but as it turned out, since the girl's father is a little busy at the moment, it's all from His Majesty, who is thus trying to gain her confidence. But this time, he doesn't even realize that his future plans and even his thoughts are already well known to her. And the amazing thing is that when they talk about him, the maids don't hide their opinion that Ariella and the emperor would make a great couple, though the girl agreed with it, but at the same time, thankfully, she already knows how wrong that opinion is. Because once upon a time she also believed in it and did not doubt his sincerity and mutual feelings. It appears that when he used to call her his most favorite girl, the Empress was constantly indignant and tried everything she could to make life difficult for both the emperor and his mistress. Over time, because of Ariella, the Empress began to have low self-esteem and a sense that she was not the only one in her husband's life. She was constantly jealous of her and even tried to become like her to interest him and see him as often as possible. She was very offended when the emperor came only to see his mistress and could forget his wife for a whole month. She constantly had to be reassured by the helpers. They supported her and tried to tell her all the information they could find out. Sometimes it worked, but most of the time, Lady locked herself in her room and hated the world. She couldn't stop crying and being disappointed in her looks, thinking that was one of the reasons why the emperor had chosen another woman. On those days when she did leave her room, the Empress tried to make sure that no one thought that the presence of her mistress was spoiling her life. Although, in fact, absolutely everyone knew about it, and there were constant rumors about it all over the palace. When the girl tried to smile, it looked so weird that some people didn't even hold back and started laughing. Meanwhile, Ariella has been helped to clean up and is waiting for the emperor, who is late for some reason. and makes her wait for him to show up, which is wrong, because normally it should be the other way around. It is not proper for an emperor to keep a girl he himself has invited to dinner waiting. As he suddenly walked up to her and touched her shoulder, Ariella managed to keep her composure, though it was quite difficult to do so. First of all, he apologized for his tardiness and promised that he would try to make amends in the near future. In reply, the girl saluted the emperor and said that it was not at all necessary to, and after that, she invited him to sit down and finally get to the tasting. To which the guy asked why she still hadn't started dinner, but in excuse, she said she didn't want to start without him. As it turned out, the emperor was not hungry at all and had only come here to spend some time with her and then go to some room and make the day more beautiful. The girl was quick to respond and offered the option to ask to fill the tub for them. In her opinion, he would not refuse such an offer and would only be glad because it is obvious that this is what he is hinting at. Ariella looked at him and tried to pretend that she was also looking forward to this moment. But for some reason, his reaction was not what the girl expected. He looked at her and for some reason was surprised at the touch. To remedy the situation, the girl decided to change the subject and asked if there was some important holiday or event today. To which the guy replied that if he wasn't mistaken, today was a very significant day, a day of prayer that he had almost forgotten about. But it seems the girl didn't just ask him that. It was to talk about the following. Day of prayer. This is the officially approved night that takes place on the 7th day of marriage. The temple orders the emperor and empress to spend the night together. Liti wanted it to happen on Ariella's first day at the palace, which means he must go to the empress and spend the day with her. So that's what the girl offered him. I really wonder how he will react and which of the two girls he will choose that day, the one he owes or the one he likes. As suddenly, he took the girl in his arms and started walking somewhere. Apparently, this was his answer to the rules of the temple. The emperor decided to ignore them and spend his time with the person he wanted to, against all odds. Meanwhile, he brought her into the room and asked her to forget about all the problems that might interfere with them at that moment. And as soon as it started, he asked her a very unexpected question, whether she was angry at him for not making her empress. Ariella didn't hold anything back and answered the way it really is. And then she asked him to spend the rest of the evening and the next morning with her, and not go anywhere. Apparently, it is also necessary to gain some advantage, namely, to leave the empress without his attention. It would make her hate her husband's mistress even more and want revenge. Meanwhile, the next day came. The assistants knocked at their room to inform that the bath was already filled at her request, but because of her meeting with the emperor yesterday, it was very difficult to wake her up. Ariella didn't even notice when someone entered her room and started talking to her. It was one of the assistants. It turns out that the emperor was very late for the prayer ceremony because he was with Ariella, which means that not only they know about it, but absolutely the entire staff of this mansion, which means that his wife will soon find out about it as well. As suddenly, seeing the joyful reaction of her assistant, the girl inquired why she's so excited about this news and yet she's not even trying to hide it. The maid replied that it was very simple, all because she treated her mistress better than the empress. According to her, everyone has known for a long time that this is not her place, and the emperor's brother also was right. Without finishing, for there were too many things to do and for lack of time, each went about his own business. Ariella was left alone, and as usual, began to think about the emperor's actions, for despite the day of prayer, he had chosen to be with her, which means he really does love her more than his wife. But why he left her is something we'll have to figure out. Because if everything was so perfect, what he did and what he wanted to get rid of is simply inexplicable. After her bath, her assistant came back to help her do her hair and pick out a matching outfit, started talking to her about the weather and getting excited about what a wonderful and bright day it was today. In that case, one of them suggested we take a walk in the garden and get some fresh air. Besides, they hadn't done that in a while. Ariella supported the idea and said that really, it would be pointless to sit at home on such a beautiful day. But at the same time, the girl is well aware that there's some hidden agenda or something like a trap behind the proposal. But still, Ariella agreed to the offer and began to watch what was going on, and the behavior of each of them, For to date, she has not begun to trust them, which is the right thing to do so she can avoid past mistakes. When suddenly, the most interesting thing started to happen, according to plan and agreement. At this very moment, she was to be met by the Empress, who every day walks at this time in the garden. In response to Ariella's greeting, Liti started to get indignant and call her all sorts of names, obviously because of what had happened tonight. She was alone all night, and it's no wonder she didn't ignore the situation, and decided to speak her mind about her husband's mistress. And that's not all. As it turns out, her aides brought her to this place where only the Empress can be. The girl tried to explain that no one had warned her about this, but it was pointless. Realizing this, she spoke deliberately of wishing to postpone the conversation to another day, for at the moment Ariella is feeling too tired. After all, she didn't get enough sleep because of the Emperor. Watching his wife's reaction, it became an incredible pleasure, drinking her aggressive reaction. No wonder hearing something like that is the most unpleasant and hurtful thing for a girl who has a husband to do. The Empress couldn't help herself and slapped Ariella really hard. In fact, she's understandable, because she couldn't have had any other reaction to hearing something like that from her husband's mistress. The girl had not expected such a result of the conversation, but in any case, what had happened had already happened. Surprisingly, even in this situation, she was able to react in time to make it look like the blow was that hard, that she almost fainted and fell to the floor. Thus she wants the Emperor to know about it, and ended up punishing his wife for doing such a terrible thing to Ariel. In her defense, Liti immediately said her punch wasn't hard enough to cause such a reaction. Even if that's true, no one will believe her now. Ariella is still believed and tried to help. At one point, when the Empress wasn't looking in her direction, Ariel looked at her aide and gave a knowing that right now she must go to the mansion and tell someone, so that the Emperor will know what happened. The girl took the hint at once and immediately set out to carry out the errand. When suddenly on her way, she was met by the Emperor's brother, who stopped her and inquired where she was in such a great hurry for, to which the girl replied that an unforeseen situation had occurred, and to tell about it, she was on her way to the Emperor. The girl apologized and explained that she was in a hurry and wouldn't be able to tell him everything in detail, no matter how much he wanted to. She continued to head further down the hall and promised that when she was free, they could continue this conversation. But it seems it will be too late. The guy had already started to analyze the situation and realized that the assistant had run out of the Northern Imperial Gardens. And it seems that's where he's going now. And it's for the best, because the more people know about the Empress's deed, the better. Meanwhile, the assistant arrived at the Emperor's study and briefly told him what had happened to It caused him a great deal of indignation, for he could never have thought that the Empress was really capable of anything like this. He said he had to go and see for himself, and afterwards, he asked her to take her to the place. Meanwhile, he had already arrived at the place where it had happened, but only the Empress's personal assistant remained there, who refused to tell him about what would result in harming her mistress. She tried to withhold this information to the very last, but it seems that after a few minutes, she'll just give up and tell the Emperor everything as it really was. He warned her that if a girl tried to hide things from him, she'd regret it. Surprisingly, even despite those words and warnings, she continued to hide the truth from him, hoping she was doing the right thing. The Emperor decided to give her one last chance and hinted that if she didn't tell him anything, she'd be fired right now. As a result, the maid couldn't stand it and tried to justify her mistress. She said that Liti did it accidentally, but this was not at all the information the guy expected to hear. He had no intention of continuing this pointless conversation, and at that moment he made up his mind to punish her, thus keeping his word, when suddenly he heard his brother's voice, who tried to stop him and asked him what he was doing here and why he was trying to hurt one of his maids. In response, the Emperor whispered a phrase that seemed to make Richt very angry. He couldn't hide his reaction, and warned that if he said it again, it would be his last words. At this point, to avoid conflict between them, one of the assistants joined the conversation and announced that Ariella had already returned to her room. And it seemed to work. She was able to get their attention to something else, which was just in time. After that, they decided to take this conversation to another time, because it's more important to check on Ariella. Besides, she can tell them a lot more than a maid trying to protect her mistress. And before he left, the emperor promised her that he would come back to this conversation and she would regret choosing to withhold any information from him. He looked at her with a sort of sinister look and made it clear that from this day forward, he would do his best to make sure she not only regretted it, but apologized as well. The assistant was, of course, frightened, but at the same time, it looked absolutely not sincere. Apparently, she is too loyal to her mistress and does not take anyone but her seriously. Meanwhile, Ariella is in her room, anxiously awaiting the moment when the emperor finally arrives. She succeeded in pissing off his wife and making it look like she was responsible for the situation and should be punished for it. She has helpers coming in all the time to see how she's doing and to tell everyone else about it. She has a smile on her face, because even when the Empress beats her or tries to hurt her, Ariella wins anyway, and watches his opponent's reaction, not hiding a smile and how genuinely pleased she is about it. Besides, she is very much relieved that in such an unforeseen situation, the assistants recognized her hints and did as she needed them to be done. So, for their excellent work, she decided to release them and let them rest for a while. The girl promised that she would try not to ask them for help and let them rest. They bailed her out really well and made everything awesome. She didn't expect this from them herself and didn't hope this plan would turn out well. After some time, the emperor comes to her, and he has an incredible desire to find out all the details and help Ariella. At the same second, the acting continues. The girl lay down on the bed and pretended that she was very badly hurt and needed help. He went up to her, took her hand, and began to ask her everything in great detail, for he did not understand how such a thing could have happened. He asked how she was feeling, to which the girl replied that she would feel much better if he stayed close by and didn't go anywhere. He endeavored to support her and promised that the situation would not remain without his attention, and the act of the Empress, also In fact, some time ago, the brothers did have to discuss an unfinished conversation. Not surprisingly, Richt was the first to start this conversation. Unlike his brother, he has no intention of putting it off indefinitely. He is madly curious to know at what point everything went wrong. What was the reason for his brother's decision? Because he always wished Ariella only happiness. It seems like something serious is going to happen as a result of this conversation, because they're either going to compromise or stop talking altogether. And as a result, the guy gave the emperor some conditions. But what's most surprising is that he agreed to it and didn't even fight back. Meanwhile, he's still with the girl in her room, trying to do what he can to make her feel at least a little better. He tries to explain to her that the situation is not her fault and that the Empress herself must take responsibility for it. As suddenly, he had the sudden sensation that someone was watching them, and that person was right outside the door. The emperor at once gave the name of this man, and it was his assistant who was actually standing just outside the door at the time and heard the whole conversation. Surprisingly, instead of clarifying the situation, he calmly called him over and asked him to fulfill one very important request. It turns out he wants to order that the girl be given the title of Marquess in the near future, and it's an order that is not negotiable. And henceforth, most importantly, she must be addressed as a lady and treated with respect, just as he or the Empress would be treated. As soon as the girl heard those words, she didn't even know how to react to it, or if she should even allow something like that to happen. But since it was an order, she only had to be thankful for such generosity. She had no time to say even one word before the emperor turned to her, and at that moment touched her hair. And even more surprisingly, he started thanking her for some kind of rescue and said that in time, he would do something more for her that she couldn't even dream about. But this time, instead of sincere joy and gratitude, Ariella decided to use the situation as an opportunity for revenge, but in a different way. Sometime later, his brother's chief assistant, as soon as he heard this information, went at once to his master's study and told him all he had heard. He told him about the Marquise, and that from this day forward, even he must call her Lady Ariella and nothing else. As it turned out, which is very strange, the guy already knew what had happened, and this information did not surprise him, because he found out about it much faster than his assistant did. And after that, he suddenly lost his mood and wanted to be alone, not to see anyone or hear anyone's voice. But is he really that upset about it? Because not so long ago, he wanted to restore justice and make Ariella respected. His reaction is indeed very strange and unexplainable, though perhaps it has something to do with that condition, and perhaps the Emperor has tricked him somehow, and did a little differently than what his brother expected him to do, and what they had agreed on. At least it looks like it really is. At this point, he began to remember their previous conversation, and thought seriously about something, namely the point about the terms between the girl and the Emperor. At that moment, he was listening very attentively to his brother, and trying to understand what he wanted and what was the point of the conversation. Richt told him that he could only take the crown if he made Ariella the only empress in the near future. At that moment, someone knocked on his office door and informed him that the Emperor wanted to see him. The guy agreed and allowed his brother in, but he seemed clearly offended about something and didn't plan on talking to him about anything. The Emperor understands this, and first of all, tried to persuade him for another conversation. But it is not clear what he did wrong, and what he did wrong. It turns out he's here for a very important reason, to discuss their previous conversation and agree on something. It turns out, something many years ago, Richt gave him and ceded the crown, and for that, the Emperor is obliged to listen to his brother's opinion. In that case, since the Emperor didn't even listen to his father and made another girl, not Ariella, he has the right to condition him and demand that he do as their father asked, for otherwise, he will take the crown that originally belonged to him. To which the Emperor replied that he would not allow him to interfere in his private affairs and to cancel the arrangement as to who the crown belonged to. Richt, of course, agrees with him, but asked him to keep in mind that this was not his order, but their father's, to whom they had promised something. So he warned him that if the Emperor did not do what he had to do, his brother would not stand by and watch what was happening. He'll do his best to make the Empress the girl who deserves it. Though the Emperor continues to resent it, he knows full well that he must do it, no matter what. It seems that this conversation will not end quickly, and will continue for a long time until the Emperor agrees to. And to make his assent heard even faster, Richt hinted that if the girl didn't become Empress, he would do his best to make her his girlfriend. Because in this case, not only the current Empress will be happy, but the girl herself will also be happy with him. The guy realizes that hearing something like that is outrageous to the Emperor, and if he suddenly becomes afraid of it, he's likely to agree to his proposal after all. Because this way, not only will he keep his promise to his father, but he'll have the girl he loves by his side. As a result, they never came to any compromise. The Emperor silently rose from his chair and said that, in his opinion, it was simply pointless to continue this conversation. He was obviously too angry when he realized that his brother would not let this matter go unnoticed, and would make sure that everything was as it should be. The Emperor simply does not know how best to act in this situation, and at the same time, he is afraid of making a mistake that will deprive him of his crown and status. He must have assumed at some point that sooner or later this conversation was going to happen, and today, it did. Evening came. Each of them began to reflect on what had happened and to plan their future actions. It is obvious that, unlike his brother, it is much more difficult for the Emperor. It is difficult for him to decide something, and even more difficult for him to make the right choice that he will not regret. After such a difficult conversation, one of them wanted to walk around the palace and think about something important. They have not been able to sleep and stop thinking about what they can expect as a result of this conflict. In any case, everyone is left with their own opinion and is trying to do their best to defend it and do it the way each of them thinks it should be done, and ruin their relationship forever over such a minor conflict. At some point, while walking around the palace grounds, he suddenly came across some amazing place he had never noticed before. At this point, he went over there a little closer and noticed some girl who looked very familiar to him. Amazingly, it's just an incredible coincidence. The guy couldn't even imagine that at this very moment, he would meet her in this place. He wondered what she was doing here at this late hour, when it was well past her bedtime.